My name is Ethan Chan. I was a candidate in Rouge River provincially, and I'm currently involved in the Writing Association as well. And we wanted to hold this in a central place. This is as close as it can get to Scarborough Centre. So we want to talk a bit about the budget. You know, NDP is committed to having a consultative process in making sure people's voices are heard in the budget processes. Unfortunately, there's not been an attempt to have community voices in this budget process from the government, and we want to make sure that at least through our channels we are able to get that voice. And we want to be focusing on three main things. Obviously, the first thing, as we heard during the campaign as well, jobs priority in terms of wages, job security, unemployment, underemployment, access to services for employment. We want to talk a bit about that as it relates to the budget. We also want to talk about the management, because there's a deficit. How do we manage the deficit? How do we make sure that the deficit does not just become a reason to cut most of the services to vulnerable populations and leaves the banks and the big corporations still continue to receive the benefits that they've been receiving. So we'll talk about what is NDP's plan proposing along that line, but also talk a bit about your ideas. But most importantly, and as NDP's platform was predominantly around affordability, we also want to make sure that we talk a bit about affordability. There was talk about TVC fare. It's a pretty high impact. HST still remains an issue that has not been addressed. So affordability in general, gas prices to rents to so on, it's of concern, and we'll talk a bit about how does the budget address or not address that in the current government's vision, but also how do we bring a vision to Ontario NDP to make sure that happens. So
thanks, Ethan. I think the first thing to acknowledge is that the government seems okay with the fact that we're not having public hearings on the budget, which is very disturbing. This is the first time in anybody's memory that there hasn't been a pre-budget process where community groups, interest groups, various parts of our province in terms of, representation have input into the budget process. Usually it's done through a finance committee, which travels the entire province in all kinds of different communities, north, south, east, west, and to engage, in a conversation about what people think should be the priorities of the government in the next year. And that's not happening, basically because the government has decided that that although they don't have a majority as a government, they want to have a majority in the committees, which doesn't make any sense, right? So they're basically saying they're not accepting the will of the people in terms of the results of the election, and kind of through a backdoor procedural process are trying to create basically a de facto majority on committees. And so we're not accepting that, and that's why there's a bit of an impasse right now. Yesterday we did offer the government, or Monday I guess, we offered the government that we would go back to the legislature even just for one day and at least set up the finance committee so that we could actually have the pre-budget process and have the hearings happen in the province. We haven't heard back from them as to whether they're going to accept that compromise, that offer, but we're hopeful that they will, because it's simply a practical thing to do. So we can argue about the committee structure, later or next week, but this week let's at least, get the legislature back and have a vote to set up the finance committee so that we can have the pre-budget hearings. Regardless of what they decide, we've decided, as Ethan said, as the NDP, that we think it's important to hear what people have to say about the future of the province in the next year and what you think the priorities should be. And so today we're doing that here. I'm going to be going across the province. My finance critic, Michael Prue, will be going to other parts of the province to gather, insights and information and suggestions. In terms of where do I see the government going with the budget, I really don't know. It's a lot less predictable this time than it has been perhaps in past years for a couple of reasons. One is there are no hearings, so sometimes during the hearings process, we get a sense, just by the questions the government's asking various deputants, we get a sense of where they're headed in terms of their priorities. We know that they had Mr. Drummond, Don Drummond, I'm sure you've all heard of him. They've engaged him in a process of identifying where the cuts could possibly come from to wrestle the deficit to the ground. Unfortunately, they've engaged him in one side of the equation. Right? They've engaged him in looking at the cuts, but we know that a budget's made up of both, expenses as well as revenues. And the revenue side is not being looked at all, not with Mr. Drummond anyways. And so we also know that we have a minority parliament, and the government's going to have to put forward a budget that one of the two opposition parties has to support. So we don't know at this point. Are they going to put in a right-wing budget to get the conservative support? Are they going to put in a kind of less painful budget to try to get our support? I think this is a decision that they are currently in the process of coming to themselves. So what we are doing is, through conversations like this, as well as other opportunities, trying to reinforce with the government that as they put together a budget, they should keep everyday Ontarians in mind. That they should be looking at not slashing and cutting healthcare services, for example, because that's something people really value and we need to improve, not make worse. And already people are finding a difficult time to access the kind of healthcare supports that they need. Same way, people are very concerned about lack of jobs. The government has failed miserably in terms of its ability to create jobs in Ontario. And in fact, what they've done has not worked. I mean, they've cut corporate taxes year after year after year, but there's no jobs being created. We had some real ideas around how we still work with business, but in a more targeted way, so that we have strings attached to any help we give to business. So we'll give you a tax credit if you hire someone. We'll give you a tax credit if you invest in your company. We'll give you a tax credit if you train workers. That way we're getting something for the revenue that we're giving up in the tax credits. So we're hoping to see the government realize the folly of their ways and stop those corporate tax reductions. Put a hold on that. Corporate taxes were reduced from 14% since 2010, 2009, from 14% down to 11.5%. They're scheduled to go down to 11 in June, and then the following year down to 10. We think that needs to stop right now. We don't think that's, not only have we not gained anything for it, but we think there are more smart ways to engage with companies in achieving something. So we want to see more focus on a targeted approach to job creation and growing the economy. And then if there's another one overall, and Nathan suggested it in his remarks as well, is that what we want to see in the budget is an acknowledgement that everyday people are falling behind. People's real earnings, people's wages are declining, and life is getting more and more expensive, whether it's the HST, whether it's utility bills, whether it's gas, whether it's transit fares. At the same time as people's wages are going down, life is getting more expensive, which means people are continuing to fall behind. And so we see that across the spectrum. People who are low-income folks are even worse off than they've ever been. We're losing, many, many people from the middle class because the jobs, simply good jobs, aren't there anymore for folks. And the only people that seem to be doing well are the ones at the very top of the food chain. And that's being aided by policies that continue to give these big tax breaks to the big corporations. Small business is something different. We think that there needs to be breaks to small business, help small business, struggle with some of the rising costs that they're struggling with too. So we're glad to see a reduction in small business taxes down to 4% from 4.5%. We hope that was part of their platform, was part of our platform. We hope it's going to be part of the budget, but we'll wait and see. So at this point, part of what we're doing is we're putting out there to the government, here are some broad areas that we want you to address. And we're waiting to see what kind of details they'll come back with when it comes to the budget.